She said, "Can I sleep here tonight?" I replied, "I only have one bed." She said it softly, standing on my porch just past midnight. "Can I sleep here tonight?" And those 5 words cracked open a life I had spent 2 years carefully sealing shut. I am Ethan Cole, a 38-year-old man who photographs mountains because mountains never leave. I live alone in a quiet craftsman cottage on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina, with an aging golden retriever and enough silence to drown in. I'd stopped letting people in, literally and figuratively, a long time ago. But there she was, Nora Hayes, 34, a travel writer from Boston with a worn leather journal, exhausted eyes, and a story she hadn't finished running from yet. A stranger, soaked not by rain but by a day that had taken everything from her booking, her options, and very nearly her composure. She hadn't come looking for me. She'd knocked on every other door first. Mine was simply the one that opened. Looked at her. Then I said the only honest thing I could say. I only have one bed. But here's what I didn't say, what I couldn't have known standing in that doorway, that the woman asking to sleep here tonight was about to make my carefully empty cottage feel, for the first time in years, like somewhere worth coming home to. So ask yourself this: what really happens when a guarded man with one bed and a broken past says yes to a woman with nowhere left to go? What do 2 strangers discover about each other when the night stretches long, the city is asleep, and honesty costs nothing? And why, when morning finally came and she had every reason to leave, did neither of us want her to? Stay with me. Because what began with 5 words on a dark porch became the last story either of us ever expected to live. It had been a quiet Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday I had learned to prefer. No surprises, no complications, nothing that required more of me than I was willing to give. I'd spent the afternoon grading student contact sheets at the kitchen table, red pen in hand, Scout stretched across my feet like a warm, breathing anchor. The cottage smelled like coffee and old wood, and outside the ridgeline behind the house had gone dark, swallowed up by an early October night. I had a cup of tea going cold beside me, and a playlist of instrumental guitar low on the speaker. That was my life. Ordered, predictable, safe. I had built it that way on purpose. 4 years ago, the woman I was going to marry sat across from me at a dinner table, this very table, and said 7 words I've never stopped hearing. "You're always somewhere else, even now." She wasn't angry when she said it. That was the part that stayed with me. She was just tired. Tired of competing with a version of me that was always 30,000 feet above sea level, always in a war zone, always behind a lens pointed at someone else's pain. I came home from the Middle East with a shelf, full of awards and a chest full of something I couldn't name and couldn't put down. Claire tried to reach me for 2 years. Then she stopped trying. I didn't blame her. I still don't. After she left, I packed everything that reminded me of before into boxes, drove those boxes to a storage unit across town, and never went back. I repainted the walls, bought a new couch, signed up to teach a photography class at the community college because someone suggested I needed a reason to leave the house. And I arranged my life the way I arrange a composition: clean lines, controlled light, nothing in the frame that doesn't serve the image. No clutter, no chaos, no people who would eventually want more from me than I knew how to give. Scout was the only exception. He asked for nothing but proximity. I respected that about him. So when the doorbell rang at 9:52 that Tuesday night, I didn't move immediately. I sat still for a moment the way you do when something interrupts a silence you were comfortable in. Scout lifted his head. I set down my red pen. I opened the door, and she was standing there under my porch light with her phone in one hand and a charger dangling from the other like a white flag of surrender. She was wearing a dark green jacket, dark jeans, and the particular expression of someone who has been holding it together all day through sheer stubbornness and is running critically low on stubbornness. Her hair was pulled back, but pieces of it had come loose. There was a leather journal tucked under her arm. She looked at me and immediately said, "I'm so sorry to bother you this late," before she'd even told me who she was or what she needed. She apologized twice before she got to the point. I noticed that. She told me quickly, efficiently, like someone used to explaining herself to strangers. The Airbnb listing she'd booked 3 weeks ago had turned out to be a scam. She'd driven 7 hours from Charlotte, arrived at the address after dark, and found an empty gravel lot where the charming mountain cottage was supposed to be. The host account had vanished. Her $280 had vanished with it. Every hotel within 20 miles was fully booked because of the Mountain Arts Festival. Her phone was at 3%. She wasn't asking to stay. She just needed an outlet and a few minutes of Wi-Fi to find somewhere, anywhere, to go. I looked at her for a moment, then I stepped aside and let her in. Scout walked straight to her and sat down at her feet before she had even crossed the threshold. He didn't do that, not with strangers. I watched it happen and said nothing. She sat at my kitchen table with her phone plugged into the wall, working through every booking app with the focused, methodical energy of someone who refuses to panic out loud. I made tea. I went back to my grating. We shared the kitchen in a silence that was, somehow, not uncomfortable. The way two people who have both spent a lot of time alone can sometimes occupy the same space without crowding each other. She didn't ask me questions. I didn't offer conversation. We just existed in the same warm room while the Asheville night pressed cold against the windows. I was halfway through my third contact sheet when I heard her set the phone face down on the table. I looked up. She was staring at the grain of the wood, both hands wrapped around the mug of tea I'd given her, and there was something in her face that she was working very hard not to show. The look of a person who has just run out of options and is deciding how to feel about that. "There's nothing," she said quietly. "Not one room, not within 20 miles. The kitchen was very still. She looked up then, and her eyes met mine, and I saw it. That razor-thin line between composure and the thing on the other side of it. She wasn't about to cry. She was something more complicated than that. She was exhausted, down to somewhere the sleep couldn't reach. And then she asked it, soft, almost apologetic, like she already knew what it was going to cost her to ask. "Can I sleep here tonight?" I didn't answer right away. I heard Claire's voice somewhere in the back of my mind. "You're always somewhere else, even now." I looked at Scout, still planted at this stranger's feet like he'd already made the decision for all of us. "I only have one bed," I said. She nodded slowly. "I'll take the couch." "You won't," I said, pushing back my chair and standing. "Come on, I'll get you sheets." I gave her my room. Fresh sheets, the good pillow, the extra blanket from the top shelf of the closet that still smelled faintly of cedar. She thanked me 3 times. I told her once that it was fine and meant it. I took the couch, turned off the hall light, and lay in the dark listening to the old cottage settle around me. I told myself it was just one night. I told myself she'd be gone by morning. But Scout had already moved from his bed by the fireplace and was lying outside my bedroom door, her bedroom door, like a sentry. Like he knew something I didn't. And somewhere, beneath the quiet, beneath the order I had so carefully constructed, something shifted. Something I hadn't felt in 2 years. Something that felt, if I was being honest with myself, a little bit like being awake. Neither of us slept. I know because at 1:30 in the morning I was still staring at the ceiling, listening to the cottage breathe around me, and the couch beneath me felt harder than it ever had before. Not because of the cushions, because of the quiet, the specific, I-charged quality of a silence that knows it is shared. I gave up around 1:45. I pulled on a sweatshirt, padded into the kitchen in my socks, and started the coffee maker. Not tea this time. This was a coffee hour. The machine hissed and gurgled in the dark, and I stood at the back door looking out at the ridgeline, my hands in my pockets, waiting for the brew. The October air coming through the door crack was cold and clean and sharp with pine. Asheville at 2 in the morning sounded like nothing. Not silence, exactly. There was a distant owl somewhere in the tree line, and the occasional whisper of wind through the last of the season's leaves, but a deep, settled quiet that felt like the world had exhaled and hadn't, yet breathed back in. I poured a cup and took it to the back porch. I sat in the old wooden chair I always sit in and looked at the dark ridge the way I always do, and tried to find the thing that usually lives there for me. The stillness. The sense of everything being exactly where it belongs. But tonight it wasn't there. Tonight the darkness felt less like peace and more like absence. I noticed the difference and didn't quite know what to do with it. The screen door opened behind me. I didn't turn around. I heard her feet on the porch boards, the soft sound of the blanket she'd brought with her trailing slightly, and then she was standing beside me, holding up her empty mug in the amber light spilling from the kitchen window. A silent question. I reached down for the small thermos I'd brought out and poured without a word. She wrapped both hands around the mug, pulled the blanket tighter across her shoulders, and looked out at the same darkness I'd been looking at. She didn't say anything immediately, didn't apologize for being awake, didn't try to fill the space with noise. She just stood there breathing in the cold mountain air like she had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. I found myself oddly grateful for that. "What are you looking at?" she asked finally. Her voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to someone who thinks before they speak. "Nothing," I said. She considered that. "You were staring at nothing pretty hard." I almost smiled. It surprised me, the almost smile, like a muscle I'd forgotten I had. We sat in the dark for a while after that, the coffee steaming between us, the owl doing its quiet work somewhere in the trees. And then, the way it only ever happens at 2 a.m. between people who will never see each other again, when the darkness makes honesty feel safe and tomorrow feels too far away to be afraid of. She started talking. She didn't tell it like a story she'd rehearsed. She told it the way people tell things when they're tired of carrying them, in pieces, with pauses. She told me about Boston, about the apartment on Commonwealth Avenue with the bay windows she loved and the man she'd shared it with for 4 years who she had also, she thought, loved, until the lease came up for renewal and he said he wanted her name off it, not because they were breaking up, just because he wanted the lease to be his. She had stood in the kitchen holding a pen and realized she couldn't sign something off that she had never actually owned, and she understood then that that was the whole story. 4 years and she had never actually owned any of it, not the apartment, not the relationship, not her own place in either. She gave back the key, packed 2 suitcases, and called her editor in the same afternoon. "I told him I wanted to do the American South travel series I'd been pitching for a year," she said. "He said yes, so I left." "Just like that," I said. "Just like that." A pause. "Everybody keeps saying that like it was brave." "It wasn't brave, there was nothing left to stay for. The brave thing would have been figuring that out 3 years earlier." She laughed softly when she said it, but I heard what was underneath the laugh, the particular ache of a person who has looked back at a stretch of their own life and seen the thing they missed while they were in the middle of it. I knew that ache. I knew it by name. She turned and looked at me then, and in the low light from the kitchen window, her face was open and quiet, and unguarded in the way that faces get when the performance of the day has finally fallen away. "Your turn," she said simply. I looked down at my coffee. I never talked about this, not to colleagues, not to the few friends who had tried to stay close after Claire left, not to the therapist I saw for 4 months before I decided I preferred the mountains. Talking about it meant picking it up again. I had gotten very good at leaving it exactly where I'd set it down. But it was 2 a.m, and she had just handed me something real, and there was something about the way she waited, without pushing, without performing sympathy, that made the words come before I'd decided to let them. I told her about the war zones, about 12 years of pointing a camera at the worst moments of human lives and sending those images around the world and telling myself it mattered, that the witnessing was its own form of help, about coming home to Claire and not being able to explain why I felt further away in our kitchen than I did in a conflict zone, about the night she sat across from me right there at that kitchen table and said the thing she said, and how I had opened my mouth to argue and closed it again because the argument wasn't there, because she was right. She had always been right. I came back from my last assignment, and I couldn't pick up the camera anymore, I said. Not pointed at a person. I tried a few times. It felt like, I don't know, like trespassing. "So you started photographing landscapes," she said. "Mountains don't flinch," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, but they don't look back at you either." I felt that land somewhere deep and specific, the way a true thing lands when you weren't braced for it. I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at me the way someone looks when they recognize something, like she'd been carrying a version of the same wound in a different pocket. We stayed on that porch until 4 in the morning. The coffee ran out, and neither of us went inside to make more. The owl went quiet. The wind died completely, and the world became absolutely, perfectly still. We talked about books. She loved travel memoirs and biographies of people who had remade themselves in the second half of their lives. I told her the last book I read cover to cover was a biography of Ansel Adams, and she said that tracked, and I asked her what that meant, and she smiled and said she'd tell me later. Later. A word that assumed a future in the same space. Neither of us addressed it. When she finally stood and said she should try to sleep, the sky beyond the ridge had begun its first barely perceptible shift from black toward the deep navy that comes before blue. She pulled the blanket around her and looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between gratitude and something quieter and more complicated than gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. "Not for the bed, not for the coffee. Just thank you." Like she meant all of it. "Get some sleep," I said. She went inside. The screen door closed softly behind her. I sat alone in the dark for a few more minutes, the empty thermos in my hand, Scout now at my feet having appeared at some point without my noticing. The ridgeline was still invisible against the sky, but for the first time in a long time, the darkness didn't feel like something I was staring into alone. I didn't know what morning would bring. I didn't know if she'd be gone before I woke up, packed quietly and grateful, and never thought of this porch again. But I knew this. Something had moved in me tonight, something I had nailed shut, something I told myself I didn't need. And the terrifying, quietly thrilling truth was this. I wasn't sure I wanted to nail it shut again. If this story is reaching something in you, if you feel what Ethan and Nora are just beginning to feel, do not leave without hitting that subscribe button and turning on the notification bell. Because what happens next between these two, when morning comes, when Nora should leave but doesn't, when Ethan's darkroom reveals something about him that words never could, that is where this story truly begins. You do not want to miss it. Stay with us. Morning arrived the way good things sometimes do, quietly, without announcement, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. I woke to the smell of coffee. Not my coffee. Better than my coffee. Rich and dark and warm in a way that reached across the cottage and pulled me upright before I was fully conscious. I stood in the hallway a moment before she saw me. Nora was at my kitchen table, journal open, Scout beside her, writing with the focused stillness of someone completely inside their own world. The early light coming through the window caught the side of her face. She looked like she belonged there. That thought scared me more than I expected. She looked up. "I made the coffee wrong, didn't I?" "It's perfect," I said. It was the best coffee I'd had in 2 years. I drank it without another word. She should have left that morning. She knew it. I knew it. She called 2 more hotels over breakfast and found nothing. I told her she didn't have to rush. Scout put his head in her lap. She stayed. And somehow one day became 2. She wrote at my table, while I graded. She made lunch from whatever lived in my refrigerator. Something extraordinary involving a sweet potato and leftover rice that had no business being as good as it was. We walked the Arts District in the afternoon, argued for 15 minutes in front of an abstract painting, and bought sourwood honey at the farmer's market because she said it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. I bought a jar too. I didn't explain why. That evening she wandered into my dark room. I found her standing in the amber light, hands clasped behind her back, reading my landscapes the way people read things that matter: mountains, rivers, a winter field in Vermont, a stretch of empty Nevada highway at dusk. She looked at every single one. "They're extraordinary," she said. Then, gently, not as criticism, just as truth, "There's nobody in them." I said nothing. She didn't push. She just walked back out. But that sentence followed me into the next morning, and the morning after that. Because she was right. And somehow it took a stranger standing in my darkroom to make me see what I'd been doing. I hadn't stopped photographing people because I was protecting them. I'd been protecting myself. On the 3rd morning, I woke to silence. Her journal was gone from the table. Scout was at the front door. I walked outside and found her in the driveway, bag in hand, keys out, looking at her car with the expression of someone making a decision they're not entirely sure about. I went back inside, made 2 cups of coffee, the good kind, not the instant, walked back out and handed her one without a word. She looked at the mug, then at me. Then she walked back inside and set her bag down. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us needed to. And if this story moved you the way it moved me living it, if you felt every single moment between that porch and that driveway, then you already know what this was. Not luck, not coincidence, just 2 people, one, us 2. Door, and the quiet courage to leave it open. Subscribe. Turn on that notification bell. Because the best stories don't end. They just find somewhere worth continuing. This has been Ethan Cole, and for the first time in years, I'm exactly where I am.